Community organizing is all about identifying interests and aligning those interests to bring people together around a common goal. To be an effective organizer, you have to get people to see your goal as their goal. And doing that requires being able to authentically articulate what moves you in a way that taps into what motivates others. In the previous video, we discussed the role of personal stories in values-based organizing, particularly as a tool for communicating the values that drive your work. In this video, we'll bridge the gap between values and action, starting with a reflection question. Then, we'll cover a discussion framework that I find useful to prompt others to move from motivation to action. And finally, I'll model that framework for you to get a full picture of what bridging values to action looks like. Okay, first, let's talk about a necessary reflection question that you must ask yourself as you begin aligning your motivations and values to the values of others. Before I go to any meeting or any event, I prepare myself by asking, what are some likely values and motivations that XYZ person or group holds? This question may seem unnatural to ask yourself, but I promise it's helpful. And you don't have to be exact or come up with a comprehensive list. A few examples will do. Take a second to think through possible answers, and luckily, it gets easier with practice. For example, I recently went to a house meeting in the suburbs of Chicago. The neighborhood is very civically engaged, and they wanted to hear of ways they could get more involved in helping their community. I thought through the interests and values of the group. I knew they were concerned about low voter turnout and wanted more people to vote on election day. At the house party, I would be discussing the role of gerrymandering and asking them to play a role in fighting it. In my mind, I was able to identify a likely shared value of justice and fair representation. They wanted higher voter turnout in order to have a better, more equitable representation in government. And my sharing on how they could take action against gerrymandering underscored the exact same thing. Voters should pick their politicians and not the other way around. It takes some practice, but it's extremely helpful in surfacing the underlying shared values. And you can use those shared values to channel different motivations towards common action. Which leads us to our next part, a discussion framework that I use in one-on-one conversations to move from values to action. And I call it listen, connect, and pivot. In the course of a discussion with someone, you do three important things. First, you listen. In any conversation, you listen openly for shared values. This is extremely important. You want to ask why they care about a certain topic or issue and reflect back to them what you're hearing. As you do this, you're thinking through what values you have in common with them or what values underscore the issue that you both care about. This part is likely easier if you did the process of reflection we just talked about. Next, you connect with them using your personal story and message. And you might share about a personal struggle that you went through that led you to a similar value, or how you felt when a certain incident happened and that prompted you to take action around that same value. And finally, you pivot to action. In the course of a discussion, you've identified what's important to that person, connected with them over shared values and interests, and now you want to express that motivation and turn it into action. And I want to give you an example of what this looks like. I mentioned earlier that I recently went to a house party where I discussed how people could get involved on the issue of gerrymandering in our country. A few people mentioned that they cared about the issue already at the top of our meeting. So how did I use that to talk about redistricting reform? It went something like this. In the first part, I listened, and I said something like, ending gerrymandering sounds like it's an important issue to you and to this community. How did you learn about it? How did you become passionate about it? How has it affected you and your community? Then I connected with them and said, I'm frustrated too. I know that after seeing examples of maps endlessly drawn in ways that protect the interests of politicians rather than the represented, I felt rage at the injustice of it all. How maps are drawn have implications on a whole range of issues that I care about, from women's rights to climate change. And in fact, having politicians that don't represent us keeps people from wanting to participate in the democratic process at all. And finally, I pivoted to action and said, and as you likely know, we have to fix this problem before congressional districts are redrawn after the 2020 census. I'm holding an event in our community next Friday to educate people on how the process works in Illinois and what we can do about it. Will you come to a phone bank on Tuesday night with me from 6 to 7 p.m. and help me build for it? With this framework, you're bridging the gap between values and action. You're asking questions of what motivates others, aligning their motivations to your own, and getting them to take a stand on what you've just identified as common ground. In this way, you're asking them to show up for their values, a much harder thing to say no to. And I find this really exciting. This is the exact type of work that sustains movements for the long term. Your ability to align with what other people care about, bring them into your values and your vision of a different reality, and then move them to action is a difficult thing to do, powerful in practice, and has enduring effects for your community organizing. With that, let's move to our final video, where we can synthesize our main takeaways and move to next steps.